When we think about history, our minds usually jump to huge events and famous names. But today, we're going to dig into something different, a forgotten court case, a quiet battle that ended up profoundly shaping the fight for voting rights in America. This is the story of the Silent Vanguard.
I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine you're told you have a fundamental right, one of the absolute cornerstones of democracy, but every single time you try to use it, there's this invisible wall standing in your way. Well, for millions, that wasn't imagination. It was reality.
So on paper, everything looked fine. The law was crystal clear. The right to vote is guaranteed. But in reality, the situation was completely different. A whole system of hidden barriers made that promise pretty much hollow for so many Black Americans. So let's actually look at what those barriers were.
So how was a right so fundamental systematically denied? Well, it wasn't through some big, obvious law you could point to. It was actually way more subtle and honestly way more effective than that.
I mean, just picture this. You're faced with literacy tests that are so ridiculously complex, a law professor might have trouble passing them. Or poll taxes, which basically made you pay for a right that should be absolutely free. And then there were these vague local rules that could change completely on a whim. The goalposts were always moving. But here's the thing about a system like that. It can't last forever without someone pushing back. And what's so fascinating about this story is that the fight back didn't start with national headlines or big-name activists. Nope, it started much closer to home.
We all have this picture in our heads of the civil rights movement, right? A story led by a few iconic leaders. But the real engine for change, so often, was found in these small towns and local communities, driven by people whose names never, ever made it into our history books.
The real heroes of this story were church leaders, factory workers, farmers, just ordinary citizens who wanted one simple thing, to exercise their constitutional right to vote. They were the Silent Vanguard, and they decided it was time to take their fight to a brand new battlefield. So instead of protests in the streets, this particular battle was waged with legal briefs and sworn testimony. They took the fight for justice directly into the courtroom. And the entire legal challenge, the whole thing, really boiled down to one simple but incredibly powerful question. Were these voting rules being applied equally to every single person? That one question struck right at the heart of the entire discriminatory system.
So the battle lines were drawn. On one side, the plaintiffs argued, look, this isn't about local rules. This is about discrimination. They said local officials were flat out abusing their power and violating people's basic constitutional rights. The defense, on the other hand, argued that their rules were perfectly lawful and just a matter of local discretion.
Man, you can just imagine the tension in that room. Everybody there knew this was about so much more than just one lawsuit. The outcome could literally unlock the vote for thousands and thousands of people in their community. The pressure on those judges must have been immense.
And then, the turning point. The decision came down, but it wasn't with some thunderous crash or a big media moment. It was with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. A silent victory, yes, but an absolutely decisive one.
And the verdict? It was clear, direct, and unambiguous. The court sided with the citizens. It ruled that the existing practices were discriminatory, and they had to be struck down. Those hidden barriers were finally being dragged out into the light.
So what was the result? Well, the impact wasn't some abstract legal idea. It was immediate. It was measurable. Black voter registration started to climb. For the very first time, people who had been pushed to the margins for so long could finally make their voices heard at the ballot box.
And that's the thing. There were no national celebrations, no victory parades down Main Street. But what happened was something so much more important. Real, tangible progress. A whole community was fundamentally changed, not by some grand gesture, but by the steady, quiet work of justice.
Okay, so this brings us to the most important question of all. Why does this case, a case that has been pretty much forgotten by history, why does it still matter so much today? Well, because its legacy became the bedrock for so much of what came after.
So why did it just fade away from our collective memory? It seems like it was kind of a victim of its own timing. See, it all happened before the major voting rights laws of the 1960s, so it didn't grab any national headlines. It was a crucial early fight, for sure, but it was overshadowed by the much bigger battles to come. History often remembers the final, loudest victory, not the quiet work that made it all possible.
But you can actually trace the lineage here. This one quiet courtroom victory laid crucial legal groundwork. It created a precedent, a kind of blueprint, that activists would use later to build the case for those landmark national laws that we all know today.
It just goes to show you, small wins really can build into massive ones.
And that, ultimately, is the real takeaway here. Democracy isn't just preserved in famous speeches or massive marches. It survives, it thrives in these quiet fights, in the patient, courageous work of ordinary people demanding that the promises of their country finally be made real.
And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. This is just one story we've uncovered. How many other silent victories, how many other unsung heroes formed the invisible foundation of the world we live in today? What other parts of our history are we still not seeing?